Hi guys, this is Miss Hall at Research Triangle High School with our second video in our series on imperialism. The first video was created by Mr. Drake and gave you sort of an introduction to imperialism. And today we're going to talk about one area where the impacts of imperialism on the continent of Africa. In this video, you're going to learn about the forces that shaped Africa in the early 1800s, how the European contact with Africa increased, how Leopold II started a scramble for the colonies, and how Africans resisted the imperial powers. By the end of the video, you should also be able to define the terms jihad, missionary, and elite. Okay, take a minute and pause the video and prepare your paper to take notes. I've given you an example here of how you can set up the front and back of a sheet of notebook paper to take notes for this video so you're ready for your quiz. Be sure to leave space to answer each question. Alright, let's get started by talking a little bit about Africa in the early 1800s. Remember, Africa is a huge continent and has a lot of different regions and a lot of different people who spoke hundreds of different languages, developed varied governments and cultures. Now, to help us understand the impact of imperialism on this huge continent, we have to first understand what was going on in Africa right before colonization. We've studied ancient Africa, but we haven't talked a lot about them for a while. So let's talk a little about what was going on early in the 1800s. In North Africa, remember, there's the huge Sahara Desert and the fertile land along the Mediterranean. Now, this region had really close ties to the Muslim world and pretty much remained under control of the Ottoman Empire. In West Africa, the grasslands were home to the Islamic reformers movement, and leaders here preached jihad, or holy struggle, and had an effort to revive and purify Islam. Several Muslim states of traders and farmers and herders existed in this area. In the forest regions in West Africa, there was a strong Asante kingdom, which traded with the Europeans and the Muslims and also controlled a lot of smaller states. Along the east coast of Africa, there were a lot of port cities like Mombasa and Kilwa, which carried on a very profitable trade. They traded slaves from the interior to the Middle East long after the European nations had outlawed the slave trade. They also traded ivory and copper to India in exchange for goods such as cloth and firearms. They were pretty wealthy kingdoms. In southern Africa, there was a lot of turmoil. Shaka, who was the ruler of the Zulu nation, had attempted to conquer a lot of other lands, and this had set off a mass migration in which a lot of people had left that area. It had also created lots of wars and chaos, and this was just a region that was struggling when the European powers came to power. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what was going on in Africa before the colonials came. As you all know from previous lessons, the Europeans had spent a lot of time trading along the African coast, but they really had not ventured into the interior much. The geography was difficult, there was a risk of diseases, and unknown native populations, and so they had sort of steered clear of that. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, remember, we've got medical advances, we've now got steamships, we've got advanced weaponry, and so everything began to change. And there were three main reasons that the Europeans began to travel deeper into Africa. One was exploration, another was religion, and of course, trade. In the early 1800s, the European explorers began to really try to push into the interior of Africa. There were daring adventurers like Mungo Park and Richard Burton, who set out to map the sources of the great African rivers, such as the Niger, the Nile, and the Congo. They were fascinated with African geography and were willing to endure some pretty hard times in order to pursue their dreams, but they really had very little understanding of the people that they met. Another group that followed these explorers were the missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant. And they really were focused on the people, and their goal was to try to win people to Christianity. And most missionaries were sincere in their desire to help the Africans. They built schools and medical clinics along with their churches. But their focus was really on ending the slave trade, which they saw as unfair. However, they did see the Africans more as people whose own culture and religions were poor and people that needed guidance, and they urged the Africans to reject their own traditions in favor of Western civilization. Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone, was probably the best known explorer and missionary, and he's the guy you see pictured here. For 30 years, he crisscrossed Africa, writing about the people he met, and his accounts showed more sympathy and less bias than most of the Europeans. He relentlessly opposed the slave trade and sought to open up the interior of Africa to Christianity and trade. The trail that Livingstone blazed really led the way and opened the doors for many following explorers and missionaries. As these explorers traveled into the heart of Africa, they discovered all kinds of goods that were great for trade: gold and copper and diamonds and ivory. And so that led to the third reason, and perhaps the most important reason that explorers and Europeans traveled into Africa, and that was for trade. King Leopold II of Belgium hired an explorer named Henry Stanley, who actually followed in the trail of Livingstone. You may have heard that famous saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," and that actually was supposedly what Henry Stanley said when he found Livingstone in Africa. Anyway, King Leopold II of Belgium hired Stanley to explore the Congo River and arrange trade treaties with the African leaders. But King Leopold's activities in the Congo set off a scramble by other European nations that also wanted to be able to trade with those African leaders. And before long, Britain, France, and Germany were all pressing claims to the region. To avoid bloodshed and fighting amongst these Europeans, they decided to hold a conference, and they held an international conference in 1884 in Berlin, Germany. Not super surprisingly, there were no African leaders invited to the conference, but at this Berlin conference, the European powers established that Leopold did have claims to the Congo Free State, but they called for free trade along the Congo and Niger River. And they also agreed that European powers could not claim any part of Africa unless they set up a government office there. Thus started the rush to colonize Africa. In the 20 years after the Berlin Conference, European powers partitioned off most of the entire continent of Africa. They established new borders and redrew the map of Africa with little regard to the traditional and ethnic boundaries. You'll see on this slide a map of Africa in 1914. This shows sort of how Africa was carved up at the Berlin Conference as well as in the years that followed. You'll notice that the Belgians continued to control the Congo. France actually had a giant share of Africa. Their land holdings at their greatest was actually larger than the continental U.S. Britain's share of Africa was much smaller, but it included really populated regions and a lot of resources, particularly in South Africa. Of course, as you can see from this map, other Europeans also joined the scramble. The Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Italians all took land in Africa. Of course, not all Africans took this colonization sitting down. The Europeans did meet with resistance across the continent. The Algerians battled the French for years. The British battled the Zulu in southern Africa and the Asante in West Africa. In East Africa, the Germans fought wars against people like the Yao and the Herero. And the Germans triumphed, but only because they used what was known as a scorched earth policy. They ended up burning acres and acres of farmland and left thousands of local people to die of starvation. So it was really a nasty military tactic and pretty indicative of how the Europeans viewed the Africans as less significant than they were. The only real successful resistance was mounted in Ethiopia. A reforming leader known as Menelik II began to modernize his country. Late in the 1800s, he hired European experts to build modern roads and bridges. He set up Western school systems. He imported the latest weapons and hired European officers to help train his army. And so when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, Menelik was prepared, and he smashed the Italian invaders who had greatly underestimated him in a battle in 1896. And Ethiopia, along with Liberia, were the only two African nations to preserve their independence throughout the age of imperialism. As you can imagine, this imperialism had some pretty major effects on the African people. One of the major ones was the new economic patterns that developed. A truly global economy was led by these industrial European nations, but it was really fed by the natural resources and the cheap labor of Africa. And as this money economy replaced a previous barter economy, a lot of the men had to become migrant workers. They had to leave their local villages and go to the mines or the cities to work. And that really shattered village life. It left women home alone to grow food and support the children. Another major impact came on the backs of the missionaries who spread Christianity. Now, they did have some positive impacts. They built schools and they taught basic literacy. They trained men for jobs in the colonial government. They built hospitals, which brought all of the many benefits of Western medicine, including vaccines and new hygienic practices, which actually ended up saving lives. So that was some of the positive impacts, but the cultural impact on Africa was huge. The Europeans were convinced of their own superiority, and they felt it was their mission to civilize the world. They pressed the Africans to accept modern or Western ideas, and many Africans accepted this superiority. They looked at it like, wow, they are more powerful than us. They've come in, they've taken over, they have better weapons, they are superior, and they began to really internalize that, and they began to share in the material advances of Western society, learning Western languages, wearing Western clothes, and adopting a lot of Western manners and ways. A new group of Western-educated African elite, or upper class, also emerged. Other Africans, of course, resented this, and they often resisted the Western efforts to force new ways on them. Well, that's about it for our study of Africa and imperialism. Go back, review the video, make sure you've taken good notes on that sheet you prepared, make sure you're ready for a quiz tomorrow on this material. You're also going to need to save this information for your This Imperial Life project. Remember, we're going to be moving on and looking into imperialism in other places. Next, we're going to look at India. Have a great day.